From a railroad bridge in northern Alabama, a man watched the swift flow of water 20 feet below. His hands were behind his back, the wrists bound with a rope, another noose, hung around his neck and attached to a thick strap above his head, hung down to the height of his knees. Some loose boards placed on the rail ties provided a foothold for him and his tormentors, 2 Federal Army privates under the command of a sergeant who, in civilian life, must have been a law enforcement officer. Not far from them, on the same makeshift platform, was an Army officer with his graduation insignia. He was a captain. On each side a lookout presented weapons, with the barrel of the rifle in front of the left shoulder and the stock resting on the forearm crossed across the chest, a forced posture that forces the body to remain upright. These 2 men were not interested in what was happening in the middle of the bridge. They just blocked the sides of the flooring. In front of one of the lookouts there was nothing. The train track entered a forest for 100 meters and, drawing a curvature, disappeared. Not far from there, no doubt, was a forward position. On the other bank, an open field sloped slightly up to a palisade of upright logs with openings for rifles and a single small window through which issued the muzzle of a bronze cannon that overlooked the bridge. Between the bridge and the pillbox were the spectators, a company of infantry, in a resting position, that is to say, with the butts of their rifles on the ground, the barrel tilted slightly back against their right shoulder, their hands crossed over their shoulders. Box. To the right of the line of soldiers was a lieutenant. The point of his saber touched the ground, his right hand resting on top of his left. Not counting the executioners and the prisoner in the middle of the bridge, no one moved. The company of soldiers, in front of the bridge, stared, hieratic. The lookouts, in front of the river limits, could have been sculptures that adorned the bridge. The captain, arms entwined and mute, examined the work of his auxiliaries without making any gesture. When death is heralded, it must be received with respectful ceremonies, even by those most used to it. For this president, according to the military code, silence and immobility are attitudes of respect. The man whose execution was being prepared was about 35 years old. He was a civilian, judging by his cultivator garb. He possessed elegant features, a vertical nose, firm mouth, broad forehead, wavy black hair brushed back, sloping to the collar of his well-tailored frock coat. He had a mustache and pointed beard, but no sideburns. His large grayish eyes gave off a gesture of kindness that was impossible to expect in a man about to die. Obviously, he was not a common criminal. The liberal military code establishes the gallows for everyone, without forgetting decent people. The preparations complete, the 2 soldiers stepped to the side, each removing the wood they had been standing on. The sergeant turned to the officer, saluted, and came up behind him. The officer, in turn, moved a step. These movements left the prisoner and the petty officer within the limits of the same board that covered 3 sleepers of the bridge. The end where the civilian was situated came almost, but not quite, to a sleeping room. The plank was held in place by the captain's weight, now it was because of the weight of the sergeant. At a signal from his command, the sergeant would step aside, the wood would swing, and the prisoner would fall between 2 sleepers. He considered this action, due to its simplicity, to be the most effective. They had not covered her face or blindfolded her. He looked for a moment at his unsteady foothold and looked. Vaguely the water that ran under his feet forming furious whirlwinds. A piece of wood floating on the surface caught his eye and he followed it with his eyes. I was barely moving. What indolent current! He closed his eyes to remember, in these last moments, his wife and children. The water sparkling with the glare of the sun, the mist that hung over the river against the steep banks not far from the bridge, the pillbox, the soldiers, the driftwood, all together had distracted him. And now he was fully aware of a new distraction. As he left the memory of his loved ones, he heard a noise that he did not understand and could not ignore, a metallic noise, like the hammering of a blacksmith on the anvil. The man wondered what this noise could be, if it came from a near or far distance. Both hypotheses were possible. It was reproduced in regular periods of time, as leisurely as the bells that toll to death. I awaited each call impatiently, without understanding why, with suspicion. The silences were getting longer, the delays, maddening. The sounds were less frequent, but their forcefulness and clarity increased, bothering her ears. He was terrified of screaming. He could hear the ticking of his watch. He opened his eyes and listened to how the water ran under his feet. If I could only untie my hands, he thought, I could free myself from the noose and jump into the river. I would dodge the bullets and swim hard until I reached the shore, then I would go into the woods and run until I got home. Thank God, it still remains outside their lines. My family is out of reach of the most advanced position of the invaders. While these thoughts, reproduced here in writing, were going on, the captain bowed his head and looked at the sergeant. The petty officer stood at one end. 2. Peyton Farquhar, a wealthy farmer, came from a respectable Alabama family. Slave owner, politician, like all his ilk, he was, of course, one of the first secessionists and devoted himself, body and soul, to the cause of the Southern states. Conditions, which we cannot divulge here, prevented him from enlisting in the valiant army whose disastrous campaigns ended with the fall of Corinth, and he resented this inglorious entanglement, longing to learn of the soldier's life and find a chance to distinguish himself. He was convinced that this opportunity would come for him, as it does for everyone in time of war. Meanwhile, he did what he could. No action seemed to him too modest for the cause of the South, no adventure sufficiently reckless if it was compatible with the life of a citizen, with the soul of a soldier, who with good will and hardly any scruples admits to a large extent this ungentlemanly saying, in the love and in war, all means are good. One afternoon, when Farquhar and his wife were resting on a rustic bench near the entrance to their park, a Confederate soldier halted his steed at the gate and asked for a drink. Mrs. Farquhar only wanted to serve him with her snowy hands. As she went to get a glass of water, her husband approached the dusty soldier and eagerly asked for information from the front. "The Yankees are repairing the railroad tracks," said the man, "because they are preparing to advance. They have reached the Owl Bridge, repaired it, and built a palisade on the north bank. By an order, posted on posters everywhere, the commander has ruled that any civilian caught attempting to sabotage the railway lines will be executed without trial." "I have seen the order." "How far is the Owl Bridge?" Farquhar asked. "About 50 kilometers. There are no troops on this side of the river. A single advance picket a quarter of a kilometer away, on the railway, and a single lookout on this side of the bridge." "Supposing that a citizen fond of hanging could mislead the outpost and manage to deceive the lookout," said the planter, smiling, "what could he do?" The soldier thought. "I was there a month ago. The flood this past winter has piled up a huge amount of logs against the quay on this part of the bridge. At this time the logs are dry and would burn very easily." At that very moment, the woman brought her a glass of water. The soldier drank, thanked him, greeted his husband, and rode away with his horse. An hour later, after dark, he passed the plantation again, heading north, where he had come from. That afternoon he had gone out to reconnoiter the terrain. He was a scout soldier in the Federal Army. 2. Falling into the water from the bridge, Peyton Farquhar lost consciousness, as if he were dead. He came out of this state when he felt a painful pressure in his throat, followed by a choking sensation. Terrible, flashing pains crossed his entire body, from head to toe. They seemed to run along specific lines in his nervous system and beat at a rapid rate. He had the feeling that a huge torrent of fire was raising his temperature unbearably. His head seemed about to explode. These sensations prevented him from any kind of reasoning, he could only feel, and this caused him enormous pain. But he found that he could move, he swung like a pendulum from side to side. Then, with a single, very abrupt blow, the light around him shot up into the sky. There was a splash in the water, a terrifying roar in his ears, and everything was dark and cold. When he regained consciousness he knew that the rope had broken and he had fallen into the river. He no longer had the sensation of strangulation, the noose around his throat, in addition to suffocating him, prevented water from entering his lungs. Hang to death at the bottom of a river. This idea seemed absurd to him. He opened his eyes in the darkness and thought he saw a light above him, so far away, so unreachable. It always sank, because the light disappeared more and more until it became an ephemeral glow. Then it grew in intensity and he realized in spite of himself that he was going up to the surface again, because he felt so comfortable. Being drowned and hanged, he thought, isn't so bad. But I don't want to be shot. No, they will not shoot me. That wouldn't be fair. Although unconscious of the effort, the sharp pain in his wrists told him that he was trying to get rid of the rope. He focused his attention on this fight as if he were a quiet spectator who could observe the skills of a juggler without showing any interest in the outcome. What a prodigious effort! What magnificent, superhuman energy! Ah, it was an admirable attempt. Bravo! The rope was untied, her arms separated and floated to the surface. He could make out her hands on either side, in the growing light. With new interest he watched them cling to the noose. They savagely tore away the rope, flung it away in a rage, its undulations like those of a water snake. Put it back on, put it back on. He thought he was shouting these words into his hands, because after freeing himself from the rope he felt the pain. Most inhuman until then. His neck hurt incredibly, his head burned, her heart, which was barely beating, immediately burst as if it were going to burst out of her mouth. An incomprehensible anguish tortured and twisted his entire body. But his hands did not respond to the order. They pounded the water hard, in rapid strokes up and down, and pulled him afloat. He felt his head emerge. The glare of the sun blinded him, his chest expanded with strong convulsions. Then excruciating pain, and her lungs sucked in a great gulp of oxygen, which she instantly exhaled in a scream. He was now fully aware of his faculties, they were truly supernatural and subtle. The terrible disturbance in their organism had defined and awakened them in such a way that they noticed things never perceived until now. He felt the movements of the water on his face, listened to the noise that the tiny waves made when hitting him. I looked at the forest on one of the banks and knew each tree, each leaf with all its nerves and the insects it housed, locusts, flies with shiny bodies, gray spiders that spread their web from twig to twig. He contemplated the colors of the prism in each of the dewdrops on a million blades of grass. The hum of the blowflies that flew over the eddies, the beating of the wings of the dragonflies, the footsteps of the aquatic spiders, like oars being raised by a boat, all this was to him a totally perceptible music. A fish jumped at his sight and he heard his own body slide across the current. He had come to the surface with his face downstream. The visible world began to spin slowly. Then he saw the bridge, the fort, the lookouts, the captain, the two common soldiers, their executioners, whose figures were distinguished against the blue sky. They shouted and gesticulated, pointing their fingers at him. The officer pointed his revolver at him, but did not fire. The others lacked weapons. His movements to the naked eye were extravagant and terrible, their silhouettes, grandiose. Suddenly he heard a loud bang and an object strongly shook the water a very short distance from his head, splashing his face. He heard a second bang and noted that one of the lookouts still had his rifle slung over his shoulder. A blue cloud was rising from the muzzle of the cannon. The man from the river saw him take aim through the sight of the rifle. Looking into the lookout's eyes, he noticed their grayish color and remembered having read that all famous marksmen had eyes of that color. However, he missed the shot. A whirlpool made him spin in the opposite direction. He was again in sight of the forest that covered the bank opposite the fort. He heard a clear voice behind him, in a monotonous rhythm. It came with an extreme clarity, drowning out all other sounds, even the lapping of the waves in his ears. Despite not being a soldier, he knew the camps quite well and what that nonsense on the shore meant. The officer was doing his morning chores. With what coldness, with what calm voice that calmed the soldiers and imposed its own, with what certainty in the intervals of time, these cruel words were heard. Attention, company. Shoulder arms. Ready. Aim. Fire. Farquhar was able to dive as deep as necessary. The water resounded in his ears like the voice of Niagara. However, he heard the crashing discharge of the salvo, and as he broke the surface, he found extremely flat pieces of shiny metal slowly coming down. Some hit his face. And the hands then continued to descend. One was placed between his neck and the shirt. It was an unpleasant color, and Farquhar energetically pulled it out. He came to the surface, breathless, after spending a long time underwater. The current had carried him very far, close to safety. Meanwhile, the soldiers reloaded their rifles by removing the ramrods from their barrels. Again they fired, and again they missed. The persecuted saw all this over his shoulder. At that moment he was swimming briskly with the current. His entire body was active, including his head, which was reasoning very quickly. The lieutenant, he thought, won't make a second mistake. This was a mistake made by an officer too attached to discipline. Isn't it easier to dodge a salvo as if it were a single shot? At this moment, surely, he has given the order to fire at will. God help me, I can't dodge everyone. 2 meters away, the incredible roar of a waterfall was heard, followed by a loud, impetuous uproar, which receded and diminished, and seemed to spread through the air in the direction of the fort, where it succumbed in an explosion that struck the very depths of the river. A liquid palisade rose, curving above him, blinded him and drowned him. A cannon had joined the other weapons. The shell churned through the water. He heard the shell whizzing ahead of him, tearing through the branches of the trees in the nearby forest. They won't start again, he thought. Next time they'll load with shrapnel. I must look at the artillery piece, the smoke will direct me. The detonation comes too late, it trails behind the shell. It's a good cannon. He immediately began to go round and round at the same point, he was spinning like a top. The water, the banks, the forest, the bridge, the fort, and the now distant men, all blended and disappeared. The objects were no longer but their colors, all he saw were colored flags. Caught in a whirlpool, he was going so fast that he was dizzy and nauseated. Moments later he was on a mound, on the left side of the river, hidden from his enemies. His unexpected immobility, the contact of one of his hands against the rock, restored his senses and he wept with joy. Her fingers dug into the sand, which she splashed on, blessing her loudly. In his opinion, it was the most precious thing he could imagine at that time. The trees on the bank were gigantic garden plants. The determined order in its arrangement caught his attention. He breathed in the aroma of its flowers. The light shone strangely between the trunks and the wind sang in their leaves a harmonious music played by an Aeolian harp. He did not want to continue running. It was enough for him to stay in that perfect place until they captured him. The loud hiss of shrapnel in the leaves of the trees woke him from his sleep. The gunner, disappointed, had sent him a random volley in parting. He jumped up, rushed up the river bank and into the woods. He walked all day, guiding himself by the sun. The forest was endless, not the slightest clearing appeared anywhere, not even a lumberjack path. He did not know that he lived in such a wild country, and in this thought there was something supernatural. At nightfall he continued forward, hungry and weary, with wounded feet. He was still alive because of the thought of his family. In the end he found a path that led him to a good port. It was wide and straight like a city street. And yet he didn't give the impression of being very well known. It did not adjoin any field, nowhere was there a house. Nothing, not even the barking of a dog, suggested a sign of close humanity. The bodies of the two huge trees looked like two rectilinear walls. They came together at a single point on the horizon, like a diagram in a perspective lesson. Above him, he looked up through a gap in the forest, and saw huge golden stars he hadn't seen, clustered in strange constellations. He supposed that the disposition of these stars hid an ominous meaning. From each side of the forest he perceived noises in an unknown language. His neck ached. When he touched it, he found it inflamed. He knew that the rope had marked him with a tragic fate. His eyes were bloodshot, he couldn't close them. His tongue was swollen with thirst, pulling it out between his teeth calmed his fever. The grass covered all that virgin avenue. He no longer felt the ground at his feet. Leaving aside his sufferings, surely he fell asleep while walking, because he contemplates another new scene. Perhaps he has come out of a delusional crisis. He is in front of the bars of his house. Everything is as I had left it, everything exudes beauty in the morning sun. He must have walked, non-stop, all night. As he opens the doors of the gate and goes up the great white avenue, he sees some clothes float slightly. His wife, with a fresh and sweet face, comes out to meet him coming down the gallery, standing at the foot of the steps with a smile of unspeakable joy, in an attitude of incomparable grace and dignity. How beautiful she is! He lunges to hug her. At the moment when he is about to do it, he feels a blow on his neck that stuns him. Blinding white light clamors around them with a cannon-like roar, and then utter silence and utter darkness. Peyton Farquhar was dead. His body, with a broken neck, swayed from one side of the Owl Bridge to the other.